Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's Officers Association webinar on working in the charities sector with Simon Allen, who's the Chief Operations Officer at the Officers Association. My name is Clive Lowe, and I'm your host this evening. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome my colleague, Simon Allen. Simon, welcome tonight, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Clive.
Could I ask you to just give a little bit of an introduction about yourself?
Yes, as Clive said, I'm the Chief Operations Officer for the Officers Association. I've worked for various charities before the OA, including Born Free and the Asfari Foundation. I'll talk a little bit more about them later. But before working in the charity sector, I worked for a number of IT and telecoms companies, including O2 and Rwandatel in Rwanda, not surprisingly. But before that, I'd been in the Royal Tank Regiment.
Thank you, Simon. So could I invite you to give an overview of the sector?
Yes, I think it's a good way to start, because if you haven't come to the charity sector before, you may not be aware of the full size of the sector. The overview is based on figures for the Charity Commission for England and Wales, and it's worth pointing out that Scotland and Northern Ireland have got their own regulatory bodies. This is for historical reasons. There are 167,000 registered charities in England and Wales, and they've got a combined annual income of around £74 billion a year. The majority, however, about 73%, are quite small and sometimes very small. In other words, incomes of less than 500,000 a year. But that still leaves over 11,000 bigger charities, which I would define as charities with incomes in excess of 500,000 a year. They, between them, have got a combined annual income of £67 billion, and they employ the majority of the 853,000 people working in the sector. Now, some of these charities are very big. The three biggest, Save the Children International, Cancer Research UK, and the National Trust, each have annual incomes in excess of £500 million per annum. Now, a large proportion of the bigger charities are based in London and South East, but obviously many of these will have operations throughout the country. But the majority of the more senior positions are based, as I said, down in the South East of England. It is a diverse sector, however. The size, location, areas of activity, the types of role you will find within the charities, the levels of specialisation, and dare I say it, the levels of professionalism or even competence all vary greatly. This pie chart gives a bit of an idea of the range of sectors within the sector. You can ignore the figures, but it gives an idea of the diversity of the charity sector. As we pointed out at the beginning, my journey started in the army. I left the army in 2000 as a major. Having a technical background and having done the weapons staff course at Shrivenham, I got my first job as a project manager with O2. I can't say I particularly enjoyed it, but it did pay well and it was a very good experience. A series of events led me in due course to Rwanda in 2006, where I was the mobile network project manager for Rwandatel, which is a local telecoms company. In contrast to working at O2, I found this incredibly satisfying. I was working for a great CEO who's a very capable American who'd been around in Africa quite a bit. And I would say that I probably did more good in that 1 year at Rwandatel than I'd done in my time at O2. Certainly I made more of a difference. In 2000, however, the Rwandan government took over the company. They decided they wanted it back, and my job ended. But I was recruited to run a local IT and technology services company called SECAM. It was one of a group of companies owned by a Swiss-Italian family who'd been out in that part of the world for about 3 generations, and they were working on their 4th generation. And again, I was very lucky with my boss. He was very capable, very astute individual, and he was a pleasure to work for. By 2010, I was looking to move back to the UK. I was taken on as operations director for the Born Free Foundation. Born Free is a wildlife conservation charity based in the UK, but with operations in Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Although challenging at times, it was a great introduction to the charity sector, and by and large, it was a thoroughly enjoyable experience. Lots of variety, lots of things to do, and I greatly enjoyed my time there. After 3 years with the Born Free Foundation, I relocated to London, and in 2014 took a job as the operations manager for the Asfari Foundation. This is a private charitable foundation which supports governance or good governance and civil society in the Middle East, and increasingly supports Syrian refugees, mostly in the countries around Syria. This led me in 2015 to the Officers Association, where I am now. So having explained how I got into the charity sector and a little bit about what I've done in the charity sector, I think it's worth, first of all, looking at what we as ex-officers can offer to the charity sector. And the first thing I would mention is soft skills. Things like flexibility, adaptability, leadership, can-do attitude. Now, most senior managers in civilian life think they have this in abundance. Sadly, many do not. But it's definitely an area which the majority of ex-officers do have. We've actually had some training in it, and it's been something which has been stressed throughout our careers as an important part of our makeup. You shouldn't underestimate the importance of having these skills. It's always, of course, slightly tricky selling these skills, because some senior managers may feel that they actually don't want somebody who's got all those skills working for them. And some of them may think that it's something they don't actually need that much, and you just need to get on with things. But when you actually get into a charity, these skills are important. Obviously, one's got to develop the way one operates within the charity sector, but these skills are really important. And to those, I would add two which are quite topical at the moment. One is integrity, and the other is moral courage. And again, those are skills which we often have, and certainly we're expected to have. And I think they're skills which are certainly valuable in the charity sector for reasons we can discuss later. The second area I would talk about is what I call staff skills. Now, all officers get structured progressive training and experience in things like analysis and planning, organizational ability, and written and verbal communication that rarely exists in civilian life. And where you do get those training in those sorts of areas, it's often a day here or a day there. It's not built into the career structure and the career progression of senior managers in the way it is in the armed forces. Even things like the use of clear and concise language is very valuable. And I might say that you should reflect this in your CV, as well as getting rid of your military jargon, as I'm sure Clive will have told some of you if you've actually had a session with him. You should avoid using jargon and waffle and pseudo-civilian management speak in your CV. Just tell it as it is and make it short and sharp. Finally, depending on your career path through the armed forces, you may have picked up various technical skills, many of which will be very valuable in the charity sector. IT and technology are very useful skills to have. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be qualified or highly a technician in those areas, but what you can bring, if you have got it, is an understanding of the application of technology, how it can be used, what its shortcomings are, and the ability to look at technology and say, yes, how can we use that? Project management, even a little bit of project management training is really useful. And if you've actually had experience of managing projects in the military, very useful indeed. Now, I mentioned financial technical skills. Charities are businesses, and I'll say this again later on. They have to be able to produce proper accounts. Many of them, sadly, don't produce proper accounts. But the better your understanding of how to read accounts, how to manage accounts, anything from the service funds accounts course, as it used to be called, to management of budgets, and especially, of course, if you've been in something like the Adjutant General's Corps with an accountancy qualification, these are all things which a charity, particularly in senior managers, will find very useful. HR. Now, in the military, a lot of the HR rules that you find in civilian life don't really apply in quite the same way. But what we do have is experience of organising and thinking about training staff, managing and running appraisals, or what we used to call annual confidential reports when I was still in the army. And it's something which is often skimped on in the charity sector, but a lot of people within the charity sector, a lot of the staff working in the charity actually value those. Events, event management. You may think, well, what do I know about event management? You know, as a soldier or an airman or whatever. But if you've been a PMC or a mess secretary, you've probably run events. And it's not running a mess dinner, particularly a mess ball, is just a big event. And a lot of charities, particularly the fundraising charities, are doing this all the time. And finally, particularly in aid agencies and overseas development agencies, logistics, if you've got a background in logistics, would also be something which they may be looking for.
Can I just ask a question there, Simon? In the staff skills section on this slide, you've got written and verbal communication. What about dealing with the media and the press?
That isn't something that I'd particularly thought about in relation to the military, but yes, you're quite right. A lot of the training for preparation for operations will have involved dealing with the press, talking to camera, thinking about what it is you actually say. Now, many of the charities, certainly the bigger charities, will have people who have got a lot of background in PR from a civilian perspective.
Right.
But that background will be much more useful, or would be very useful probably, in a smaller or medium-sized charity where you may not have the headcount to allow you to have a PR specialist.
Right.
And that's not to say that you can think you're the PR guru, but what it does mean is you may have more of an awareness of it, which you can bring to discussions with other members of the senior management team.
Okay, thanks.
The next thing I was going to talk about is finding the right charity. This is very important, both in terms of your prospects for finding a job, but also for your job satisfaction when you get there. Now, with so many charities, what I'm going to say is a broad generalization, but as an ex-army officer, I'm good at broad generalizations. But I'm going to start by looking at bigger charities. Generally speaking, they'll pay more. They're bigger, there's more people to manage, there's bigger budgets to manage. And so with that, and arguably more responsibility, with that often comes more pay. There are generally more roles available because they are bigger, and they're generally better resourced. However, being a big charity, the roles are often more specialized. Recruitment may be more rigid. They may be less flexible about who they're looking for. They may be looking for somebody who's done a particular role in a charity before. Rather than looking at what other skills you may have and thinking, well, actually, it'd be quite useful to bring somebody in from outside a charity. So sometimes you can play on that as being a positive. And the charities can be quite bureaucratic. The small charities, they will often have informal recruitment. It may even be by word of mouth. They can be very hands-on, and the job could bring complete responsibility, possibly because you may be the only person working for it. The downside is the pay will generally be much lower. The roles will often be part-time, and they will also be often operating on a bit of a shoestring. This isn't necessarily a problem, but what it does mean is what you can achieve will often be quite limited because you've only got limited resources to do what you're trying to do. But conversely, you may be able to make a big difference in a very small way. Medium charities are probably, you could say, the sweet spot. Because they are not too big or too small, generalists are often needed, somebody who can bring a range of skills into play. There'll be varied responsibilities. The outcomes will be more visible than you'll find in a bigger charity because you're working on projects which are deliver more quickly and you can see the outcome more quickly. But the outcomes will probably be more significant than you'll get with a small charity. The downside is that pay will probably be, let's say, moderate. There's probably less scope for internal progression as well. So if you want to move on to something bigger and better, you may have to move from the charity you're in to another one. It's worth saying that if they're not looking for specific skills, they're often looking for specific experience. Now that can work in your favor. So for example, one of the reasons why I got the job at the Born Free Foundation is because I'd spent 4 years out in Africa, and I'd got the management experience as well to go with it. But the downside is they may be quite fixed in what they want, and they may want somebody who's worked in the charity sector before. But you can often find your way around that. Charities may not know what it is they really need. So they may think they're looking for one thing, but actually what they really need is something else. All I can say is that if you do your research, you may actually be able to look at things that charity is doing and bring out things that you can offer, which they may not necessarily put in the job description, but are related to the role. You will often be the off-the-wall candidate, so you need to play to your strengths, much as I've just been saying. And you should certainly do your research. Now, this applies to any job, but it particularly applies to charities. Well, I suppose you could say it applies to working in the commercial sector as well. Look at the charity accounts. Now, the advantage of charities is they do have to publish accounts, quite detailed accounts, on the Charities Commission website, and you can often find a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of the charity from reading those accounts if you know what to look for. So we've looked at what sort of charity you might be targeting, and we've looked at what we can offer. So let's look a little bit about how you might enhance your employability. Now, some of you will be coming from another civilian job and decide you want to move into the charity sector. Others of you will still be serving in the military. So your circumstances will be slightly different, but I'll just run through a few things that you can think about. First of all, charity governance. Surprisingly, the governance of charities is often quite patchy. Some charities are very good at it. Some charities are mediocre, and some, to be honest, are dire. And if you run across a charity where the governance is dire, you need to, I think, look at it very carefully and decide, do I really want to be working for them? But the important thing is to try and understand as much as you can about charity governance. So you at least understand the environment within which you're working. Particularly important if you're going for a more senior role. There are a lot of resources on the Charities Commission website where you can find out about charity governance and what the responsibilities of senior management and trustees are, and how trustees relate to the charity. Commercial awareness. In fact, sorry, I'll just talk about charity trustees. Charities, particularly the smaller ones, often need trustees. They're normally unpaid, and they do come with regulatory responsibility. But it's invaluable experience, and it looks good on your CV. So if you are based in the UK and you still have time to serve, look around to see whether there's any trustees that you can volunteer as a trustee for. They may say no, but they may say yes. And my experience, and I've been a charity trustee as well, is that charities are often looking out for somebody who's got lots of common sense, who's prepared to give it a bit of time, and you'll pick up that experience as you go. Commercial awareness. Charities are businesses, and people often forget that. But an understanding of things like value for money, cash flow, cost-benefit analysis, and cost control is often poor. The more you can read into this sort of thing, but also more importantly, just think about charity as businesses and the fact that they've got to bring in income, most of them, and that they have got to try to do their best with their responsibilities to the people who have made the donations to make the best of that money, leads you to start thinking about, are we getting the best bang for our buck if we're going to support one particular project or a different project? And so getting return on investment, in effect, is something which is often not thought about sufficiently well. Data protection. This is a huge area, and it's getting bigger. There's something called General Data Protection Regulations, which is an EU initiative, which is still going to apply to us after Brexit in one form or another. And it's a bit of a monster. And a lot of charities and a lot of businesses, dare I say it, are ill prepared for it. I'm not suggesting that you can become an expert, and there are a lot of snake oil salesmen out there who are passing themselves off as experts. But the more you understand about it, the better, simply so that you are aware of what the pitfalls are, and you've got an awareness of where you need to seek extra specialist advice. If you understand it, then it will greatly help your employability. Sorry.
Are there courses that people could go on prior to joining a charity, do you think, that should help them in data protection? There are,
but they're probably quite expensive.
Right.
I don't think you necessarily need to go on a course. The Information Commissioner's Office website, sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful, the ICO office website has got a lot of information about data protection, about GDPR in fairly digestible forms. Now, GDPR itself is the size of the Gothenburg Bible, but it's been distilled with guidelines, and particularly for charities, which you can look at. And again, going back to the Charity Commission website, I think you'll find there's stuff there as well. HR. Now, I mentioned HR earlier. It can be highly bureaucratic, and it doesn't need to be. But it's definitely worth understanding best practice in recruiting staff. If you are aspiring for a management role, you may well be recruiting staff at some point. Understanding how to go about it, particularly in a smaller or medium-sized charity where you may not have a full-time HR professional to support you, is worth having. Again, the Arbitration, Conciliation and Advisory Service, ACAS, which some of you have heard of from trades disputes with trade unions and so on, is actually a very effective organisation. They do run courses, going back to what you were saying earlier. I've done a couple of courses with them, normally about a day, and the cost of those is not great, a couple of £100 at most. So things like managing grievances and disciplinary issues, very useful course, because you do and will have to deal with disciplinary issues. If you show that you've got this on your CV, then you can play on that. Particularly if you're pitching for a role which is going to have a team management responsibility, because then it will help to overcome any residual prejudice that there may be that military people just shout at their soldiers. They don't necessarily know how to manage them. Application of technology, we talked about this earlier. Many senior managers lack a technical background. I'm not sure that you can become a technical guru overnight in the short time that you've got available to you. But if you start thinking about how what technology you have used during the time in your service, and not necessarily taking it directly into civilian life, but thinking about your understanding of technology, how it's used well, how it's used badly, that is something which you can think about, at least in advance for a job application. What is more important, however, is financial knowledge, particularly if you're about to leave the military and you haven't yet done your resettlement courses. Then there are some very good courses on accountancy for managers. There's something called the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, which does do modular training courses which you can actually pay for and do by remote. That is definitely worth doing if you haven't already got any background financial training. And another thing which I think is definitely worth bearing in mind is having an affinity for the charity's objects. Charitable objects are what the charity is there for, and it will state it in the founding documents of the charity, which again you can find on the website. But there's no point in applying for a charity if you've got zero interest in what it is they're doing. But if you've got some knowledge of it, then it will make you more employable. And so going back to the Born Free Foundation again, the fact I've lived in East Africa for 4 years, I had actually been out on safari several times, driven myself on safari, meant that I understood a lot about what it was they were trying to achieve.
Well, Simon, that's really interesting. But fundamentally, what's it like working with a charity?
It's a good question. I would say it's got many of the same challenges as you find in the private sector. It can be challenging. It can be frustrating. It's certainly worth remembering that people working in charities are not necessarily angels. You're going to find domineering personalities, infighting, turf wars, vested interests, resistance to change. It sounds like the MOD, but actually it's, in some charities it's worse. But that doesn't apply to all charities. So it's very much like private sector companies. Some are really good, some are not good. And you'll find the same thing. But don't believe that just because you're going to work in a charity that everything's going to be sweetness and light. You'll also find that fundraising can come to dominate the charity's behaviour in some cases. And sometimes you almost feel that the only purpose of a particular charity is to raise funds to carry on raising more funds. And it's also worth remembering that good intentions don't necessarily lead to good outcomes. And it's particularly so in the aid sector, the overseas aid sector, and I've seen it myself. But even charities working in the UK, they may have the best of intentions. They may think this is a really good idea, but it may not actually achieve in the end what they're trying to do. And sometimes may have perverse outcomes. But in the right charity, you're going to find variety. I think you'll find intellectual stimulation because there's always new challenges coming along. And there's always ways of doing things better. I think you'll find job satisfaction. I got lots of variety, particularly in the Born Free Foundation. And I, on one occasion, found myself flying out at 48 hours notice to Turkey, where we were rehabilitating 2 dolphins, which had been rescued from a swimming pool where some idiot had thought it would be a good tourist attraction. And we had them in a sea pen, but they'd got a virus and our vet needed to work on them. But none of the divers we normally had available were available. And I had a British Sub-Aqua Club diver's qualification, which I picked up in the army. And I flew out there with one other diver who we did manage to get. And we spent 3 or 4 days rearranging the pen so that we could actually get them into a treatment pen within the bigger pen. And I was thinking to myself, okay, well, this is different. And it was great fun. And not something you would normally find if you're working for a bank. I suppose taking a slightly bigger look at job satisfaction, I actually happen to believe that commercial businesses do deliver social good by and large just by doing their job and doing it well. But in charities, it's often more obvious and more immediate that you're actually giving something back to society. And for many of us, that will bring satisfaction as well.
Good. So what are the resources that people may have to help them in their decision making? Well,
there's quite a lot of information out there. I've mentioned a couple of them, but it's just worth mentioning them again. And this is not the end of the pool of resources that you'll find online. But the Charity Commission website, very good. It's got lots of guidance for trustees, got lots of guidance for running charities, how to do charity accounts. It will explain the charity accounts in quite some detail. And it will explain about charities' articles and foundation documents and constitutions. The National Council for Voluntary Organisations, NCVO, they have similarly a lot of good resources. They also run courses as well. Obviously, you're generally speaking, you have to pay for them, but if you've got money in your resettlement budget, you may find that you can go on 1 or 2 of their courses. The Information Commissioner's Office, ICO, I've mentioned already, they're particularly important for things like data protection, which we touched on, and then ACAS, who I've talked about before. They have a lot of good information about HR and managing disputes and grievances, recruitment and that sort of thing.
Well, thank you, Simon. I'll leave that slide up for people to be able to jot down those websites. Can I ask you just a couple of questions, Simon?
Yes, of course.
There's quite a lot of, if you like, current hostile scrutiny of charities going on at the moment, particularly following the kids company issues, and most recently, of course, with Oxfam. So how's that likely to affect charities in the longer term, do you think?
Well, I think it'll be very interesting to see. I think charities will have to, well, I think this will be a real wake-up call. The smaller charities, which are particularly dependent on fundraising from the public, know that they can't afford to lose their reputation. I rather suspect that some of the bigger charities where they have, this is just supposition on my part, but I think it's informed supposition, where they've become increasingly dependent on government funding, have tended to maybe slightly lose touch with that, because they've got contracts, they've got established connections with government, and maybe they felt that they could afford to maybe put less emphasis on the fact that they have got to stay engaged with the public. That's a general point, but it's worth pointing out that the troubles affecting Kids Company are very different from the troubles affecting Oxfam. In both cases, I think you can say that there was a fundamental breakdown in leadership and good management and good governance, but in different ways. Kids Company was definitely the case of poor governance, a domineering CEO, a compliant set of trustees who were not asking the right questions, and a hostile atmosphere within the organisation. And if you see a charity like that, then you need to think very carefully about whether or not you want to work for them. Oxfam is rather different. It still does have issues with lack of integrity, moral courage, which are things that I mentioned earlier. They're operating in very unusual environments, and people often don't know what's going on there. Or at least they want to kind of slightly brush it under the carpet. And I think they've realised they can't do it anymore. In both cases, I think the Charity Commissioner is going to be looking a lot harder at the performance of big charities in particular, but it will trickle its way down. But I think there's going to be much less of an assumption in the media that charities are necessarily run well and run by people who are either necessarily know what they're doing or necessarily are nice people, which I think in the long run will be a good thing, but it's probably going to be a rocky patch for a while.
I think maybe it will be, yes. What are the key military charities out there?
Well, there's a lot of military charities out there. Mm-hmm. In fact, the Confederation of Military Charities is in this very building, as you know, COBSIO. It's quite just a small coordinating body. I suppose there's two groups of charities, or three groups of charities probably. There's the long-established charities, which most of us will have heard of. Well, most people who are still serving will have heard of. The Royal British Legion, of course, who run the Poppy Appeal, and actually help fund the Officers Association, it must be said, because we've worked with them very closely since just after the First World War. There's the Army Benevolent Fund, or as it's now known, the Soldiers' Charity, the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund, the Royal Navy, Royal Marines Charity. Those are all of the single service charities, I would say. Yes. There's SAFA, which a lot of us will have heard of when we were still serving, and is still very important for looking after families and ex-military. There's the Regular Forces Employment RFEA Association, that's it, the Regular Forces Employment Association. They do much the same for other ranks as we do for officers in terms of employment support. And there's BLESMA, the Limbless Association, and Hague Housing, which many of you won't have heard of, but it provides housing for ex-military. But then there are the newer charities, some of which have been incredibly successful and are now very well known and household names. Help for Heroes, Walking with Wounded, Combat Stress, Veterans Aid, and FIMT, which many of you won't have heard of, but is a very effective charity, again based in this building, the Forces in Mind Trust. And then the third group, I would say, are the regimental, particularly in the Army, the regimental benevolent funds, which are often very small, not making very many grants, but some of them are bigger. The Gurkhas Welfare Trust, for example, is one bigger one.
Yeah. Do you think people could find opportunities within those military charities?
I think quite possibly, yes. it's worth bearing in mind that the Officers Association probably only has about 8 or 10 ex-military. So less than a third of our staff are ex-military. So just because you are ex-military doesn't mean you're going to get a job with a military charity, because they will be looking for the right skills and the right people to fit into those particular roles. But it's certainly worth looking at. And of course, your military background will be of value to them. But I think people need to look more widely.
Simon, this has been great. Can I just ask one last question before we close then? Is working in the charity, you talked of charities and some of these are quite small ones. Is working in the charity sector a full-time job, or could it be a part-time job which people link to a portfolio of employment opportunities?
I think very much so. I'm the Asfari Foundation, which I mentioned before. I was only working 3 days a week, but there is the catch. I was working 3 days a week in what was actually a 5-day-a-week job. And you may well find that, particularly with smaller charities. Bigger charities, I think it's probably easier to work part-time. Or if you are quite clear that the remit and responsibilities don't extend much beyond the 2 or 3 days that you think you're going to be working. Because obviously if you are working a portfolio, taking a portfolio approach to employment, it's no good if you end up working 7 days a week, because your 3-day-a-week job is not actually a 3-day-a-week job.
Simon, that's really interesting. Thank you very much indeed. That's been very, very interesting. Thank you very much for your time. And it's been great to have you here today. So,
no, it's a pleasure.
Thanks. And thank you all for attending, and I wish you all a very good night.